Hello, and welcome back to another historical video, this time about the Battle for Crete as portrayed in Forgotten Hope 2. The map in Forgotten Hope 2 is quite scaled, much more so than, for example, St. Vith, one of my previous historical videos on FH2, but I can still use it as a reference for the story of the battle. I'll focus on the flags of Maleme Aerodrome, Hill 107, and Chania, because that's where most of the action took place. Souda Bay is also a real place, but saw most action before the battle began, and Monastery Odigitrias is also a real place, but is in reality about 140 kilometers to the southeast of where it's located on this map. I've also visited Crete in real life, and I've taken some pictures there that I will show in this video. In autumn 1940, the Germans started planning an invasion of Crete. To control the sea and airways in the eastern Mediterranean, they would need the island, and the strength of the Royal Navy would prevent the Axis powers from conquering Crete by sea. The airborne invasion of Crete would be the pet project of General Kurt Student, the creator of the German Airborne Division and the commander of 11th Air Corps. Hitler was not very enthusiastic about this plan, but he gave it a go as long as it wouldn't hamper the preparations for Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's main goal in the war at that moment. Originally, Operation Mercure, Operation Mercury as the invasion of Crete was codenamed in Germany, was planned for May 17, 1941, and over 500 Junkers 52 were ready on airfields in Greece to fly towards Crete and drop the paratroopers on what they thought were weakly defended positions. The invasion had to be postponed to the 20th, however, because a large oil tanker carrying 5,000 tons of airplane fuel still had to cross the Adriatic Sea towards Greece. The German plan was to drop 22,000 troops, 8,000 paratroopers first and about 14,000 mounted troops in follow-up planes and troopships at 4 locations: at Maleme Airport, that would be the Storm Regiment; in the valley southwest of Chania, that would be the 3rd Regiment and a battalion of pioneers; at Retinon and at Iraklion to the east, which are not on the map, to conquer the airfields there. On the Forgotten Hope 2 map, only the first 2 drop zones are portrayed, so I will focus on these in this video. In the original plan, there was also a maritime phase planned for the following days. This phase was only added to reassure Hitler, who had many reservations towards the airborne invasion. German intelligence didn't know much about the British defenses on the island. Recon flights had missed most of the well-camouflaged positions. They underestimated the strength of the defending force. They didn't expect any Greek, Australian or New Zealand forces on the island and estimated the British strength at 5,000. While in fact about 42,000 troops were on the island, most of them because they had been evacuated from Greece and were left on Crete to defend the island. The Germans also seemed to expect to be welcomed by the civilians of Crete, even though German intelligence had reported the Cretans to be stubborn, fierce and hot-headed on the eve of the invasion of mainland Greece. Even though the British had used the Enigma machine to crack the German code, their preparation wasn't very much better. They knew about the plans of the Germans and even had the landing zones, but their preparation for the battle was lacking. Their commander, General Major Bernard Freyberg of the New Zealand Division, was the 7th commander of the troops since they had been occupying Crete in November, and he only arrived there April 29th. He set up headquarters of Beevor, the name of the Allied army on Crete, in a quarry just north of Chania, on the western side of the Akrotiri Peninsula. On a real map, the headquarters would have been around here at this location. No quarry on our map though. The Akrotiri Peninsula forms the Bay of Souda for the most part, and this bay was a natural harbor and a very important target for the Germans to conquer. In the 21st century, Suda Bay looks like this. And as you can see, it has the Commonwealth War Cemetery there right now. The headquarters for Freiburg was bare. There was only an officers' mess. Office workers or telegraphists were lacking. Contrary to Churchill's orders of November 1940, no extra measures were taken for the defense of the island. The thing which would be decisive when it comes to the course of actions taken during the battle is a misinterpretation of intelligence about German forces and their plans for attack. While Freiburg received information about 3,000 to 4,000 paratroopers in the first flight to Crete, and maybe some reinforcements by sea, notice the maybe, and other reports containing contradicting numbers when it comes to the ratio of seaborne and airborne troops, that got the headquarters a bit confused, he started to focus on the idea that the main invasion would be seaborne and not airborne. This led to a series of decisions which would prove fatal for the defending forces. The first one was to move troops from Maleme Aerodrome and the Aya Valley southwest of Ghania towards the coastline in order to fight back a seaborne invasion. While this would turn out to be one of the major German drop zones. This is the Aya Valley. On the 20th of May 1941, in the middle of the night, the German paratroopers started preparing for their departure. They were sweating heavily because the night was hot and their gear was as heavy as when they had dropped over Narvik the year before. In the darkness of night, confusion ran rampant as weapon canisters fell and sprang open, orders were inaudible because of the engines making noise, and the flashlights with which signals were given were clouded by dust. Boarding up, the officers of the glider group of the Storm Regiment received note that they would face 48,000 men and not 12,000 as anticipated. Around 4 a.m. the first planes departed, whipping up huge dust clouds, which caused the following planes to be unable to take off immediately after, thus delaying the invasion. The first wave consisted of 70 gliders with 10 men each of the Storm Regiment. The Junkers 52 contained 12 paratroopers and their canisters each. General Sussman and his staff were also on their way in a glider, but their cable broke over the island of Aegina off the coast of Athens, and they crashed. In reality, the flight from the Greek airfields towards Crete was about 100 kilometers. The main fleet of Junker 52s flew over the Aegean Sea at low altitude until they saw the summits of the Cretan mountains. The Fallschirmjäger were told to prepare for jump, and in their typical eagle dive, they left the plane one after the other. For the New Zealand Infantry Company on Maleme, supported by stranded personnel of the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm, the morning of the 20th was one like any other. The airborne invasion, which had been predicted to come on the 17th, never materialized, so now they thought it would never come. On Hill 107, just south of Maleme, the heavier guns were manned by General Weston's Marines. And if you visit Hill 107 today, then it will look like this when you are looking towards Maleme. You can see that the German war cemetery is there right now. The 10 Bofors AA guns around the airfield were manned by gunners of a light artillery battery or by Australians who kept taunting the RAF personnel by shouting, "Where is the Air Force now?" Most of these 10 Bofors guns were at the seashore and only a few were southwest of it. So in reality most Bofors guns were on this line here, defending the airfield from an attack from the north. On Crete I have visited a cafe 107, and the guy running it is collecting memorabilia from World War II, and he also had a Bofors gun in his little museum. You can see it right here. Since there was some sort of air raid every morning, the 20th was no exception. Shortly before 8 AM, the noise of engines was to be heard at the airfield, and although the radar had picked up this enemy force, communication was so bad that it hadn't reached the troops defending the airfield. Dornier 17s and Junkers 88s were attacking the airfield now, followed by fighter planes. Their targets were these Bofors guns. After the attack was over, the New Zealand 22nd Battalion noticed the gliders coming in. Every infantryman opened fire with whatever he could lay his hands on. About 40 out of 70 gliders landed on the rocky shores of the Tavrounitis River west of Maleme. The others were shot down, sometimes crashing because the pilot got hit. Shortly after, the Junkers 52 were arriving. The officers at Beevor's headquarters were looking at the planes and saw black silhouettes coming out of them. At first, they thought the planes were smoking because they were hit, but then the parachutes became visible. White for paratroopers and red, green or yellow for weapon canisters, equipment or supplies. New Zealand officers ordered their men to aim for the boots of the paratroopers to lead the target for the falling speed. This worked quite well, considering the number of Fallschirmjäger who dropped dead on the ground, having their parachute falling over them like an instant shroud. The fate of the paratroopers depended mostly on where they landed, in some sheltered terrain or right in front of enemy positions. At Maleme, only a few people from the RAF personnel were looking up while the Junkers were dropping their load. They could see the parachutes open at about 100 meters above ground. Some paratroopers would have their chutes open so quickly that they would get stuck on the tail section of their plane, while others got caught in the engines of the following Junkers. The defenders opened fire with everything they had, but they could not shoot at Germans who had landed in the Tavrounitis riverbed. This is the Tavrounitis riverbed, and in reality it was a very dry and rocky riverbed. The proposal to use the guns on Hill 107 to fire at those paratroopers was dismissed because they were needed to fire at, quote, targets at sea, unquote. Brigadier Meindl concluded that the majority of the enemy forces was between his position in the Tavrounitis and Chania. For some reason, the Tavrounitis flank was not reinforced. So the Germans planned to encircle Hill 107 by a flanking maneuver west-southwest from this riverbed. Like this. However, they kept losing commanders at a very high rate. They got killed or wounded in this first phase of the battle. The Storm Regiment could use the riverbed of the Tavrounitis for cover, but the 3rd Battalion ended up in a massacre, landing east of the airfield towards Chania, somewhere around this location. Most of their men landed on top of the New Zealand 23rd Battalion, one group even landing on the battalion headquarters. Colonel Leckie killed 5 and his adjutant shot 2 without even getting up from behind the crate that he was using as his desk. Former prisoners from a penal colony on Crete were promised pardon when they would fight the paratroopers, so 60 of them went in enthusiastically, killing about 110 paratroopers in 1 hour. Even if a paratrooper managed to land safely, he could only start fighting when he would have found his weapons that were in the canister. If the canister had landed in an open field, collecting the weapons was suicidal. Out of all commanding officers, Lieutenant Horst Treves was the only one who didn't get killed during this landing. The 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Parachute Regiment met a similar fate when they landed in the Aya Valley southwest of Chania. During the first and the second wave, both sides had little consideration for the Geneva Convention. There were many reports of prisoners being shot and killed. The British also heard a story about German paratroopers using captured patients from a hospital as a human shield, but it's not 100% proven that this story is true. Cretans resisted heavily everywhere. Boys, elderly men and women were fighting alongside the Allied soldiers in some kind of guerrilla warfare. Even priests took part in the fighting. This meant a huge surprise for the Germans, who were told that the Cretans would receive them with open arms. This, together with the losses, 1,856 men on the first day alone, made the Germans very angry and they retaliated against the local population later. Colonel Andrew, the responsible officer for the area around Maleme and Hill 107, knew nothing about the Germans moving in on those objectives, because all lines of communication were interrupted. Most lines were above ground. They went from pole to pole and were really fragile. A near hit by a bomb could cause them to break easily. Observation posts in the area didn't have any radios, and messengers could not get through to the area because of massive enemy air raids. The troops at the airfield had varying success. The platoon along the coastline held the parachutists who came from the Tavronitis riverbed, but the 15th platoon on the west side of Maleme had a tough time fighting them. There were only 22 men and didn't have any machine guns. Around 10 AM, Major Brown's paratroopers moved in on the airfield, and in order to stop them, Company Commander Captain Johnson called for the 2 Matilda tanks which were in reserve for the defense of the airfield. Andrew, however, thought it was too early to use them and wanted to save them for later. Soon after, the Germans broke through, over the bridge spanning the Tavronitis riverbed between the 2 New Zealand companies and overran the RAF camp. The bridge in reality was about here, and when the Germans moved in, they overran the RAF camp, which was about here. An RAF officer forgot to burn the codebooks, so they all fell into the enemy's hands, together with the order of battle of Beevor. The stressed-out Fallschirmjäger instinctively shot at surrendering ground personnel, but stopped doing so after NCO Lawrence complained heavily about this. A German officer was brought in, and they were spared. Surviving this ordeal was no safety guarantee though. The Germans moved to Hill 107 using the prisoners as a human shield. This story did get confirmed by several sources, including eyewitnesses, resulting in a massacre when a New Zealand section attacked the Germans from the flanks and several prisoners tried to escape, with varying success. Other personnel who had evacuated the airfield earlier joined the New Zealand companies and fought on. At 5 PM, after many attempts to get information about the situation, or at least contact with troops who were there or had been there, but without any success, Colonel Andrew sent in the Matildas. They crossed the airfield, ignoring the enemy presence there, and headed for the Tavronitis riverbed. One of the crews discovered they had the wrong ammunition, and their turret couldn't turn, a rather late discovery. They turned around, leaving the other tank on its own. This tank hit a big rock while turning to engage the enemy and got stuck. Now it was this crew's turn to find out that they could not turn the turret either, and they abandoned the tank. The infantry escort suffered a few casualties and withdrew. On this old screenshot you can see the Matilda that has been present on the Crete map in earlier versions of Forgotten Hope 2. At 6 PM, Andrew radioed that he would have to withdraw if he would not get any supporting troops from the east, something he had asked for before but was denied. Although it's understandable that Andrew thought like this, it's less understandable why he never went to take a look at the battlefield, because then he would have seen that both C Company at Hill 107 and D Company at the Tavronitis riverbed were both still holding. Even though they had suffered great losses, they had inflicted even greater losses on the enemy and therefore didn't feel like retreating at all. In the valley southwest of Chania, the men under command of Captain von der Heide tried to break out, but they were held by a weird mix of troops, consisting of a Greek regiment, an Australian reserve unit, New Zealand Fuel Company and Cretan civilians. On the evening of May 20th, most surviving German officers thought they had lost the battle. They hadn't taken control over either Maleme Aerodrome or Chania Harbor. Their losses were staggering. Any counterattack would drive them off. Only Student, back in Athens, wanted to continue. All other high-ranking officers thought that Crete was a failure and they had to get out as quickly as possible. However, the Allies didn't mount a big counterattack, probably because the focus was still on a seaborne invasion, and Maleme wasn't viewed as a major target by the Allied command. but also because Andrew's warnings were not taken seriously. One small counterattack was executed, but it was too weak to be able to gain any objectives. And in the darkness, the attack turned into a chaotic runaround in which the troops lost contact with each other and only coincidentally got into fights. Fortunately, more often with the enemy than with each other. At 10 p.m. on the 20th, Freiberg signaled to Cairo that it had been a hard day. They had been fighting hard, killed many Germans, held all airfields and harbors, although barely, and communication was very difficult. At that very moment, things started to go wrong at Maleme, but he didn't know that. According to a German war correspondent, only 57 men could fight around the airfield and the Tavronitis Bridge, which is this bridge, which in reality was a bit further north. So the situation looked grim for them, also because Storm Regiment's only surviving officers were Major Stenzler and Captain Gericke. However, at this point, the Allies started to make mistake after mistake. Andrew, still waiting for support from the east, had trouble communicating. His command post had a radio, but they could not see the airfield. Obviously, the command post was not in this hut on the map, in reality. The defenders on the airfield didn't have any radio, and in the map they do, as you can see. Actions by Crete Force headquarters had a confusing effect on Andrew's command post. Orders were to not arm the mines on the airfield. Brigadier Hargest's reply to the request for retreat if support was not coming was, well, if you must, you must. Assuming incorrectly that two of his companies on the edge of the airfield had been overrun, Andrew decided to pull back to defensive positions before daylight, when the Luftwaffe could make such a maneuver too dangerous. He warned Hargest about this move, but no reply ever came. The messengers carrying this message to C and D companies could not get through to them. The supporting companies which eventually did come didn't have any contact with each other. In the darkness, they couldn't find C company. Apparently they were as close as 200 meters away from them when they concluded they had been overrun, so they turned around and left. Around midnight, D Company's Captain Campbell heard about the withdrawal of the remainder of the battalion. He wouldn't believe it. Searching for water for their men, Campbell and the Sergeant Major of his company went towards Hill 107 to find out that the message was actually true. The battalion headquarters was deserted. Best move for them now would be to withdraw too, so the Germans took Hill 107 the next morning without any considerable fighting. C Company was warned about the withdrawal on the morning of the 21st of May. Their commander, Captain Johnson, now had to choose: stay and prevent enemy aircraft from landing on the airfield with the risk of being targeted by the Germans, or leave the airfield to the enemy. Since they were out of supplies and they badly needed reinforcements, at 4:20 a.m. they tied their shoes around their necks by the laces and tiptoed off the airfield between the snoring Fallschirmjäger. During the morning air attacks they hid in trees and finally joined the 21st Battalion. The counterattack on Maleme was planned for 1 a.m. on the 22nd of May, because fighting at night was disliked by the Germans very much, plus it would give the Allies the protection of the darkness against air attacks. The reinforcements needed for this counterattack were depending on replacements coming from the east. As soon as those would arrive, the Australian battalion would leave for the airfield. They were not allowed to leave immediately because that would leave part of the coast unguarded, a total no-go in Freiberg's book, because he still expected a seaborne invasion. Although the plan was to start the attack by 1 a.m., delays caused it to only start at 4 a.m, and if the Australians would be late, the time of darkness would be rather short to fight in. Because drivers had a lot of trouble on the badly maintained roads of Crete, and the route through Chania was very crowded, the attack started 2.5 hours late, resulting in the fight taking place in early daylight. Lieutenant Upham from the New Zealand battalion mentioned the fact that the Germans were caught unprepared. Some of them didn't wear any trousers or boots. The 3 supporting light tanks soon ran into trouble. One got hit by a captured Bofors, the second had one of its gears broken. The third one was withdrawn because it wasn't allowed to operate on its own. Except for the seaside, where D Company reached the eastern end of the airfield, the attack bogged down around Pyrgos, 2 kilometers east of the airfield. After having fired the boy's rifle, out of frustration, Lieutenant Maxwell and his men came under machine gun and mortar fire, so they had to retreat. On the southern flank, some terrain was gained by the 21st Battalion, but around noon it was clear that the attack had failed. The New Zealanders were exhausted. The Germans rapidly pulled away all Junkers 52 wrecks from the runway in order to land 2 more battalions. Hargest, watching this, told divisional headquarters that the Germans were probably planning an evacuation, another example of a total misinterpretation of the facts by the Allies. On the evening of the 22nd, Freiberg was weighing his options. While he first thought they were winning the battle, he now realized they weren't, and the disappointment about that overwhelmed him. There were several options: leave Maleme to the enemy by withdrawing to Galatas, southwest of Chania, surrender quickly, or perform a fighting retreat towards the south with a difficult evacuation towards Egypt. The only alternative to these options was to attack again, but this time on a grand scale, and thus with many losses. The Germans would have had a full division on the ground by the time the Allies had amassed enough troops for such a big attack, and Freiberg didn't want to go into history as a butcher who sent his soldiers into a meaningless death, so he decided to withdraw. On Friday the 23rd, German troops who had landed on Maleme made contact with the Germans from the Aya Valley. The German victory was now certain. On the 24th, Chania was bombed by the German 8th Corps with 2 intentions: scaring the civilian population and blocking roads by rubble in order to prevent troop movements of the enemy. After this bombardment, the 8th Corps withdrew from Crete to prepare for Barbarossa. When I visited Chania, you could still see some buildings that were there in World War II and got bombed, and it also had information plaque next to it. In the early morning of the 25th, General Student landed on Maleme, and on that day Radio Berlin announced the invasion of Crete, a sign that the German High Command finally started to believe they would win. The defenders mounted an attack on Galatas, which is southwest of Chania, with the use of a pair of light tanks in order to relieve some units who had stayed behind, while the bulk of the army withdrew. This attack was not very successful in that they could not retake Galatas, but they did help the cut-off units to rejoin the army. After the battle it was mentioned that if this fighting spirit and the correct type of command had been used at the beginning of the invasion, the Germans would have lost the battle for Crete. On the 26th of May, the line just west of Chania held against the advancing Germans, partially because the Luftwaffe accidentally bombed and strafed their own troops for 50 minutes. The Germans attacking the line were aiming to punch through towards Perivolia, where the Greek 2nd Regiment was about to fall apart. This would mean that Suda Bay would come under attack. On the 27th, a reserve unit was ordered to counterattack the Germans. They marched through Chania towards the north, to the Akrotiri Peninsula. They had to make contact with several other units, but they all had retreated the night before. This is another great example of lacking communications between the units. At 8:30 the German artillery fire began. The reserve unit had to fight the paratroopers which were on the march from Chania following the coastline. They also had to fight against the 100th Mountain Regiment, and the Germans from the Aya Valley could finally move up towards Chania. The reserve unit held them off throughout the day and in one case even through to the next morning, but they all had to fight their way off the peninsula. This move into Chania almost cost the defenders 1,000 men, the biggest tragedy being that the reserve unit finally saw action, but now it had been useless, contrary to 5 days before, when they could have been decisive in an Allied victory. Captain von der Heide and his men moved into Chania, where they were greeted by wounded Germans on the main square. The mayor wanted to hand over the keys of the city to prevent more civilian casualties. But he wouldn't believe that von der Heide was actually the commanding officer, because he looked like a scarecrow, unshaven, with dirty clothing and a handkerchief tied around his head. The Germans thought Freiberg would retreat towards the east to join his forces in Rhetimnon and Heraklion, while his actual evacuation plan was to move to the south, towards Sfakia. General Wavell, Supreme Commander of the Middle East, also thought retreating eastwards would be best. So the Germans and Wavell would think that retreating like this would be best, while Freiberg wanted to retreat southwards. So Wavell delayed his permission to go southwards until the afternoon of the 27th, more than 30 hours after Freiberg had radioed they would lose Crete. During the evacuation, the British, Australians and New Zealanders had a rough time. They were exhausted, were lacking water and had to climb a rough path through the mountains. They had to stop every 20 minutes to give the soldiers some rest, during which most men fell asleep immediately, only to be awakened with difficulty when the march was resumed. After having reached Sfakia, the ordeal wasn't over yet. The mountain troops were hot on their heels, so the passes leading towards Sfakia had to be guarded, which was done by the Australians. Even on the ships towards Egypt, the men were not 100% safe, as the Luftwaffe tried to bomb the vessels leaving Crete. During 3 nights, some 6,000 men were evacuated from Sfakia. In total, about 18,600 men of the 32,000 troops that were by then still on the island were evacuated successfully. On the 1st of June, Theo Walker, the commander of the Australian 7th Battalion, which was actually planned for evacuation the night before, but lost their places on the ships to British commandos who took their place by jumping the lines, handed the Germans the note of surrender. The battle for Crete was over. The numbers of losses vary depending on the source you are using. You can find between 3,500 and 4,000 German dead or missing, half of which was suffered on the first day. There were about 2,500 German wounded. The Allies lost about 1,750 dead or missing, a similar number of wounded and over 12,000 prisoners of war. This is only counting the land forces. Even though the battle was over now, the fighting on Crete would not be. Many guerrilla groups in the mountains would launch a fierce resistance campaign against the Germans, which would continue until the island was liberated in May 1945. If you have any questions or remarks, please post them in the comments. That's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.